Let's add just a little bit of state to our running recipe example. And so to motivate the need for state, let's change it up a bit. And instead of there being 3 recipes, let's pretend that there's 300. So we don't want to show all of those recipes at once like we've been doing. We only want to show one at a time and be able to click back and forth to move forward and backward. Now I only still have 3 recipes, but you can see what's happening here. 1, 2, recipe 3, and then I'll cycle around to 1 and I can go backwards. So in this case, our state is just remembering the number of the current recipe we're looking at. This is different from the actual recipe data itself because the recipe data doesn't ever change. We can stick that in memory and leave it there the whole time the application's running, whereas we have to keep updating the index as we move left and right. So how do we do that? Well, first we have to decide which component is going to store that state. In this case, it's going to be our menu component. Before, the menu component is what showed us all the recipes. Well, now the menu component needs to be in charge of keeping track of which recipe it's supposed to be showing. So I'm going to scroll down here to the menu component, and you'll see we still have a return statement with that JSX code. But before that, we set a couple of things up. And this is the important piece right here, is a call to the React hook called useState. So hooks are a React term for functions that hook into the inner workings of React. So similar to the previous video, the useState method returns an array of objects and functions, 2 of which we're going to use here, and that is in particular the value of that state, so the current index we're looking at, and then a function that lets us update it. So every time that view is rendered, every time we update the screen that we're looking at, this function gets called. We call the useState hook, and it gives us whatever the current value of that state is, and we can use that to grab the specific recipe we want out of our array of recipes, and then it will get rendered down here with the JSX. Now the differences here to recipe1.jsx is that first, we're only displaying a single recipe, and second, that we've added the previous and next buttons. Now notice also with those previous and next buttons is we've added an onClick attribute. And so that's React's way of letting you specify the code you want to run when something gets clicked. So when we click the previous button, this lambda here gets called. And if we click the next button, this lambda gets called. And all it's really doing is changing the index of the recipe that should be displayed. So we take current index plus 1 if we click the next button. And then I added a little bit to it. I used the mod of the array length so that that value will wrap around. So once I click 3, then it'll wrap back to 0. And then I also did something similar up here where I subtract 1 from the index and then do a mod so it wraps around if you go below 0. One other thing I'll mention quickly as an aside, when you do a mod of a negative number, you get a negative number back. So I also had to add one more little addition here so that my index stayed positive. In any case, when you click on the button, you compute the new index, 1 up or 1 down with any rollover, and then you pass that new value into that setIndex function that came back from the useState up here. And so what that does is it updates the state. That magic closure or whatever is under the hood in React that's remembering our index gets updated. And part of the behind the scenes React engine is when state gets updated, then it figures out what components need to be redrawn based on that change in state. Typically, if you change some state, then what you're looking at should change a little bit. So React figures out what changes and then goes through and redraws the screen, which is what we see here. So we click on next, the state gets updated. So the current index is now 2, and it also redraws the screen to show us recipe number 2, or we can go back to recipe number 1, or we can go back and roll around to recipe number 3, and so on. So that is the quick introduction to state, just using that use state hook. And you can also see, of course, how to put a click listener on things. In a real React app, state is considerably more challenging because there's more pieces of state and oftentimes multiple components that want access to that state. But we'll get into those details in a future video.